November 1942. The night air over the South Pacific is thick, heavy with salt and cordite. I imagine myself standing on the deck of a rolling Allied destroyer, boots slick with spray, eyes straining into a darkness that feels alive. Somewhere out there, beyond the black horizon, Japanese ships move like ghosts. The sea is calm, almost mocking. The men around me whisper, not because they want to, but because fear lowers the voice without permission. They do not yet know what is coming. They only know that something is wrong. Then, without warning, the ocean itself seems to tear open. A towering column of fire erupts off the port bow. The shock wave slams into steel. Men are thrown to the deck. Someone screams that we've been hit by a torpedo, but no one saw a submarine, no periscope, no wake, just death, arriving silently from impossible distance. In that moment, I know exactly why Allied sailors would later call it unnatural, monstrous, and deeply unsettling. This is the work of what many would dismiss at first glance as crude, ungainly, even ugly. Yet it would terrorize naval convoys across the Pacific like no other weapon at sea. I am speaking of the Japanese Type 93 torpedo. The Allies would later give it a name that carried both fear and reluctant respect: the Long Lance. When I first began studying it, I remember being struck by a contradiction. How could something that looked so industrial, so inelegant in photographs, become one of the most lethal naval weapons ever deployed? The mystery deepened the more I read survivor accounts. Ships hit from ranges that defied every Western assumption. Attacks launched without submarines anywhere near. Night battles that turned into chaos within minutes. Slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. The Allies were fighting not just an enemy fleet, but an entirely different philosophy of naval warfare. Japan's need for this weapon was born long before the first shot of the Pacific War. After World War I, the Imperial Japanese Navy understood one brutal reality. In any prolonged conflict, it would face larger, wealthier opponents. The United States Navy, with its industrial power and endless fuel supplies, loomed like a giant across the ocean. Japan could not outbuild America ship for ship, so it chose a darker, more precise path. If it could not win by numbers, it would win by shock, by range, by night, and by terror. The torpedo became the equalizer, not a small defensive weapon, but the centerpiece of an entire battle doctrine. Japanese planners envisioned decisive fleet engagements where waves of torpedoes would shatter enemy formations before battleships ever exchanged gunfire. To do this, they needed something revolutionary: longer range, higher speed, bigger warhead, and above all, stealth. Here is where the story turns almost unbelievable. While Western navies relied on compressed air or electric propulsion, Japanese engineers took a risk bordering on insanity. They chose pure oxygen, highly volatile, incredibly dangerous. One mistake during handling could turn a destroyer into a floating bomb. Even seasoned officers feared it. And yet, the payoff was extraordinary. By using oxygen instead of air, the Type 93 produced almost no visible wake. No telltale bubbles, no white line slicing across the sea to warn the enemy. It could run farther than any torpedo in the world, over 40 kilometers at lower speeds, and still more than 20 kilometers at blistering attack velocity. When I first encountered these figures, I thought they must be exaggerated. They were not. Allied intelligence dismissed early reports as impossible. That dismissal would cost thousands of lives. The torpedo itself was enormous, over 9 meters long, nearly half a ton of explosive in the warhead, Type 97 high explosive, designed to break the spine of even heavily armored cruisers. It was so large that Japanese destroyers had to be designed around it. Their decks bristled with massive launchers, often reloadable in the heat of battle. Where Allied destroyers carried guns as their primary weapon, Japanese ships treated torpedoes as the true killers. I imagine the training that went into this. Night after night, crews practiced launching spreads in darkness, guided by intuition, mathematics, and relentless drilling. Japanese sailors were taught to fight at night with almost religious devotion. They learned to estimate enemy courses by silhouette alone, to fire without radar, to trust their torpedoes to find targets long after the launching ship had vanished into the dark. When the war began, the results were devastating. In early engagements around Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and the Java Sea, Allied forces were repeatedly caught off guard. Ships exploded seemingly at random. Commanders believed they were facing submarines or mines. Some suspected sabotage. Few suspected destroyers firing from beyond visual range. I think of the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942. In a matter of minutes, 4 Allied cruisers were sunk or mortally damaged. The night was confusion incarnate. Searchlights, flares, gunfire. But beneath it all ran invisible death. Type 93 torpedoes slipped through the water, unseen, unheard, until impact. Survivors spoke of sudden walls of flame, of ships breaking apart with horrifying speed. Many never even knew what hit them. The psychological impact was profound. Sailors began to fear the sea itself. There were no warning signs to watch for, no defense that seemed reliable. Even when escorts were alert, even when formations were tight, torpedoes still came. The knowledge that an enemy could strike from beyond what you believed possible gnawed at morale. I have read letters from Allied sailors describing sleepless nights, convinced that any dark shape on the horizon might unleash death from nowhere. And yet, this weapon was not invincible. It demanded perfection. The oxygen system was temperamental. Leaks could be fatal. There were incidents, quietly buried in Japanese records, of destroyers lost to their own torpedoes detonating during combat or even training. Handling procedures were strict, almost ritualistic. One careless spark, one damaged valve, could annihilate a ship. Still, operational history shows how effectively the risk was managed. From 1941 through mid-1943, Japanese torpedo attacks consistently outperformed Allied equivalents. American Mark 14 torpedoes, plagued by faulty detonators and depth-keeping errors, were the bitter counterpoint. I cannot overstate the irony. While Japanese crews wielded the most advanced torpedo of the war, American submariners often watched their weapons strike targets and fail to explode. In convoy warfare, the terror multiplied. Merchant sailors, already vulnerable, faced an enemy they could neither see nor outrun. A single destroyer, properly positioned, could cripple an entire convoy in minutes. I imagine the dread as lookouts scanned empty seas, knowing that emptiness itself could be lethal. Comparisons are inevitable. Against British and American torpedoes, the Type 93 was simply in another league. Greater range, larger warhead, higher speed. It forced the Allies to rewrite their tactical assumptions mid-war. Night battles, once thought manageable, became nightmares. Eventually, radar, improved training, and sheer industrial output would turn the tide. But for a critical window, this ugly weapon dominated the darkness. What fascinates me most is how its reputation lingers. Even today, naval historians speak of it with a mixture of admiration and unease. It was not elegant, it was not safe, it was not forgiving, but it was brutally effective. It embodied the Japanese naval doctrine of the time: decisive, risky, all or nothing. As the war dragged on, the advantage faded. Allied radar improved. Air power extended its reach. Destroyers no longer roamed freely at night. The Long Lance, for all its power, could not change the outcome of a war decided by factories and fuel, and yet its impact remains undeniable. When I close my eyes and return to that November night in 1942, I do not think first of admirals or grand strategy. I think of sailors staring into darkness, unaware that the sea itself had become a weapon born of desperation, shaped by genius, and unleashed with terrifying effect. History often remembers beauty, elegance, and heroism, but sometimes it is the ugly things, the crude, dangerous, misunderstood machines that leave the deepest scars. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo did exactly that. It rewrote the rules of naval combat, terrified convoys across half the world, and forced an entire generation of sailors to fear what they could not see. And that, perhaps, is its final legacy. Not just as a weapon of steel and explosive, but as a reminder that in war, innovation does not need to be pretty to be devastating.